It's good to have you back, and I hope you're doing well. The first application deadlines of this MFA cycle are in a few short weeks, so today we're re-releasing our MFA applications episode from last year featuring Cady Vishniac, the editor-in-chief of The Workshop. In this episode, Cady and I break down how to nail every part of the MFA application. I think it is must-listen content for anyone applying to programs, as is last week's episode with Gregory Spatz, the MFA director at Eastern Washington University. I hope you enjoy these conversations and good luck on those applications. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a new interview with a current student from one of the country's 250 plus MFA programs. Until then, you can find MFA Writers on Instagram and Twitter, as well as mfawriters.com. Feel free to shoot us a direct message on one of those platforms or an email at mfawriterspodcast@gmail.com. We love to hear from listeners. And if you have a minute to rate or review the show, the best place to do that is on Apple Podcasts. Doing so will help boost our podcast as we try to boost these amazing writers. Finally, as always, thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy the episode. Welcome to MFA Writers, the podcast where we talk to creative writing MFA students about their program, their process, and a piece they're working on. I'm your host, Jared McCormick. Today is going to be a little different. It's November, and that means MFA application season. So today we're going to do a special episode mostly focused on the MFA application process. And I'm super excited to be chatting with Cady Vishniac, the editor-in-chief of The Workshop. Cady Vishniac attended The Ohio State University as the first MFA student to be awarded a Distinguished University Fellowship. Her stories have been published in Joyland, Glimmer Train, and New England Review, winning contests at Ninth Letter, Greensboro Review, Mid-American Review, New Millennium Writings, Lascaux Review, American Literary Review, New Letters, and Salamander, as well as the Anthology Prize in New Stories from the Midwest. Her most recent publications are 2 stories in Tikkun and a Yiddish translation in Los Angeles Review. She's been writing for The Workshop since 2015 and became its editor-in-chief in 2020. Cady, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much. I'm really glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you. We were chatting before we started recording about how much I've used that website. I remember The Workshop, before it was The Workshop, it was called MFA Years. And when I was applying, that was a huge resource for me. So I'm glad to have you here as someone who can speak to all of those little things that add up during the application process to make it stressful, to say the least. So I thought first off, we could start by just kind of thinking back about the application process. I mean, when I was applying for MFAs, it was 2 to 3 years ago at this point, and it really feels like forever ago, honestly. It was this strange time in my life where I thought about nothing else other than like juggling all of these components and trying to figure out what I was supposed to be doing. So one thing I remember is just like scouring the internet for any and all resources that might help me. What do you remember about applying for MFA programs?
Oh, I just stopped sleeping. I remember just that feeling of stress sinking into my body. I did not sleep at night. I found some Girl Scout cookies, usually when I was feeling a little bit stressed about applications, and I ate a lot of them. I have a sensitive tummy. It was a bad idea. And so I just remember feeling like the stakes were the highest that they could possibly be. And Like I had to get into an MFA this freaking year. I had to do it that way. And then I had to stay in the MFA and obviously like be a star student and complete my novel, which would come out with a Big 5 publisher the year after I graduated, because that's how everyone does it, right?
Yeah, of course.
Did not work out that way. And I'm also very glad that it didn't quite work out that way. But I remember being anxious about that in a way that I think I might no longer be capable of getting anxious about anything. I mean, it is something that will really mess with your head to be in this protracted state of I'm asking people for a thing and they won't tell me if I've got it for 5 months.
Yeah. Yeah. And putting like months of time into preparing this thing. And then, oh man, that moment where you send it off, like you said, and you just have to wait. And it's like you've been doing nothing but working on these applications for months. And then it's completely out of your hands, which I don't know. For some people, I guess is freeing. For others, is just compounds the stress, I think.
Yeah, because like when are they going to email me back to say, yes, you're in. We recognize your unbridled genius. We're going to make you famous. I think it just like the stakes felt so high. Obviously, if I got into a good, fully funded MFA, I was going to be a famous writer in like 2 years. And if I didn't, then I sucked and I was never going to be any kind of writer. And I think that kind of black and white thinking can really be a problem for a lot of people.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And then you add in the fact that like it costs so much money just to apply. I mean, I think I applied to like 9 or 10 programs and it costs around $1,000, probably a little bit over that all in. And, mostly to receive rejections, right? But, I mean, I did get into a couple of programs and that was a nice feeling, but the stakes did feel really high in that moment.
And I think also like spending absurd amounts of money to mostly receive rejections is really good practice for all writing contests. You're now ready to pay narrative $23 to reject you. Congrats.
Yeah.
But at the same time, something that I think a lot of people in my year when I was applying, like 2015, just did not know about. Oh gosh, I was applying in 2014. I'm old. I'm having an old moment. There wasn't as much systematic information or information sharing about application fee waivers, which are huge. I mean, I know someone who applied to 11 programs and paid for one. Oh, and wow. They had to be very strategic about where they applied. I simply did not know those existed until after I'd applied.
Yeah, we'll talk about that a little bit because I bet there's a lot of listeners who still don't know that those really exist.
Yeah, it's huge.
How do you go about like getting a fee waiver?
So part of the issue is that if you're an international student, and I am putting together the fully funded list right now, and I'm kind of just constantly encountering new rage about the unfair treatment of international students. But part of the issue is that there are not a lot of fee waivers for international students. I think you can get them from maybe Cornell and Washington University, St. Louis. Mm-hmm. I think there is an application fee waiver going on right now for anyone who sends in a super early application this week at University of Alabama that includes international students. Those are pretty much the only ones I've heard of. Many schools will give application fee waivers to former McNair scholars. Mm-hmm. Many schools that are part of the Big Ten Academic Alliance, that's a misnomer. There's more than 10 universities in the Big Ten right now. But they have across all of those schools, they actually have a fee waiver program that will allow you to send off applications to Iowa, Illinois, I think Wisconsin, Ohio, all of them.
And then specific schools also, you can reach out to them directly about fee waivers. Is that right?
There are some. And a lot of schools, you'll reach out to them and they'll say, so what? But I have started to try and catalog this actually on the new fully funded list. Mm-hmm. So there's a category for fee waivers everywhere. A surprising number of them just seem to not do anything for anybody, which I find a little frustrating. But there are a lot of schools that are actually working hard to set up their own like just for that university fee waiver. And then there are schools like, I think it's Ole Miss and University of Tennessee and McNeese State. It's actually always free to apply. And if you make it past the first round, then do they have you send in the application to the graduate school.
Right. Yeah, I remember that with University of Arkansas. I applied there because they didn't have a fee for the first round. You only pay if you're accepted, which was nice. So, I mean, just thinking about the amount you're going to pay in fees just makes it all the more important to really do your research and think about where you actually want to apply. So I'm thinking before we talk about like the actual components of the application and how to approach those, let's talk about what potential applicants should consider when deciding where to apply. I will say there is no perfect program. There's just really like places that are a good fit for you. And it really depends on you and what you're looking for and where you're at in your life. So there's a lot of factors that go into this. It's not an easy thing to break down. But that said, I don't know about you. I'm a bit obsessive about these things. And so I remember like trying to figure out every possible angle when I was considering a program and like what I might be missing and how I could like get a little edge here or there. So anyway, so I've put together a little list of considerations. I figured we could go through them one by one and just talk about them. So let's start with faculty, which obviously is like a really important one. How important is the faculty, do you think? And what should applicants be thinking about related to them when they're thinking about applying to a program?
I think the faculty it's pretty important. I think some applicants, in my opinion, just go way overboard. There are people who write one thing, but are excellent, really, truly excellent at looking at other types of work. So there are people out there who write very, very traditional, neatly turned novels of 250 pages. And they're going to be able actually to provide really good comprehensive commentary on your experimental poetry fiction hybrid.
Right.
And because of that, you don't necessarily need to find a teacher whose work is, quote unquote, like yours. You need to find a faculty member who can speak to your work.
Yeah.
I think that can often take the form of finding a faculty member who can be more empathetic about some of your life experiences. I wrote a lot of stuff about being a single mother, and I wrote a lot of stuff about Judaism, and I honestly did sometimes find that people were not only not prepared to get it, but were not getting it in ways that were kind of sad and bad and angry making in workshop. And I think you can alleviate a lot of that by finding faculty members who are able to look at your subject matter and not necessarily feel any feelings of like, oh, I don't know, man, why is she a single mom? Can you talk about who the dad was more? I don't understand. Where's the dad? Where is the dad? That's kind of weird that there's no dad. You should explain that.
Gosh.
So, and I'm sure you could get very similar discussions from all sorts of different groups, people of color, people writing about their disabilities. So I think finding a faculty member who writes like you in terms of form, not actually as important as finding a faculty member who's going to be able to manage a workshop and appropriately respond to your work in terms of content.
So I couldn't agree more. But how? How do you how do you quote unquote find a professor who is going to do that when you haven't met the professor and you haven't been in one of their workshops? How are you going to know that they're going to respond in a positive way and be able to give you positive feedback?
So I think part of that is you wait till you get in and then you interrogate them.
Yeah.
I think that can be really difficult to discern in terms of when you're applying. I mean, certainly you're going to see, if you read the professor's work, and they write extensively about their experience as a mother. Like that really resonated with me. If I read the professor's work and they're writing extensively and sensitively about disability, that's kind of a hint in terms of whether or not they would be good at workshopping anything having to do with disability.
Right.
I think there's definitely that. I do think that in the end, none of us are psychic. Academia can sometimes be sketchy. And you might decide based on someone's writing that you idolize them and then show up at their school and you're like, who is this person? They're so unpleasant. And that, it happens. I think it's impossible to be 100% sure, but you can certainly read professors' work and try to evaluate when you're applying. And you can definitely, once they let you in, you can just straight up be like, so I'm a single mother. Are people like going to respond to my work appropriately in workshop? And see what they say.
Yeah. I mean, they're human beings. So if you get the chance to talk to them, I think maybe some students or applicants might be intimidated by the idea of just having a frank conversation with someone they really admire that's in the, has a successful writing career. But in my experience, you can just talk to these people and ask them frank questions and they're going to give you honest answers for the most part. And if they won't give you honest answers, then maybe that's a good hint that you shouldn't be attending that school. Another thing to think about is the students too, right? The faculty is important, but the students you're going to be working with is just as important, maybe more important. Those relationships are going to determine whether your experience is positive or negative in a lot of ways. So it's hard to know who might be accepted alongside you, but there are ways to find out who's already there, right? Is that something you did? Did you try to reach out to students who were already in the program and talk to them?
Actually, I did a little bit. And this is, I think we're going to get maybe later into draft Facebook group. That's great. Yeah. There are other programs that just list students on their websites with emails. I think that, if you're talking about like Iowa or Michigan, like feel free to email people, but understand that they might be getting 50 emails a day right now.
Right.
From, people trying to feel out the program. At the same time, for me, this was very much, once I got in, the program really jumped on it. I mean, they got me in touch with a bunch of current students. So it's one of those things that's very difficult to do until you've been accepted and then very easy to do. And if they're not introducing you to current students, then just walk away because that's weird.
Yeah, I remember thinking, okay, like I want to know like what students there think before I apply to the program. I found it incredibly hard to get any information before I was accepted. So I reached out and asked, hey, can I talk to a student? And they said, well, after you're accepted, then we'll put you in touch with people. That's really the first moment that started this podcast. Was I thought, I wonder if there's a podcast where people talk to students who are in programs, and there wasn't. And
there is now.
Yeah. So now here I am a couple of years later doing it. But you mentioned MFA Draft, which is a Facebook group that I went on there a lot when I was applying. So you can talk about that a little bit. What is that?
So MFA Draft is a Facebook group wherein people who are applying sort of commiserate and also get advice from people who have already been in programs, been accepted, attended, in my case, finished up. There was a guy who was like in a tenure track creative writing position for a while who had just like come up in MFA Draft and was still answering questions in there every now and then, which I thought was super helpful. And I think that it can feel very intimidating to some people for a variety of reasons to be in that group. I think that when you are in an incredibly vulnerable place and you are asking these questions that feel super urgent to you, and someone's like, you're the fifth person to ask that today. It's really dumb. Why don't you search this group? It can be kind of demoralizing, right? Yeah. And you can end up feeling very sensitive and feeling very scared. You may, in fact, be the fifth person that day to ask that question, and it may be a bad question. And you do need to search the group first. But I also think that as scary as it can be to people, I think that most of the people in it, even when they are crabby, have really good intentions. They want to help you. And they would, they want you to come and ask, even if you're told no, because hearing that no will probably make your application stronger.
Yeah, I remember feeling that exact same way. That I got on there a lot and I read it a lot. I don't think I ever actually asked the question because I was a little intimidated by it that I was going to ask a quote unquote stupid question. But there are a lot of people on that Facebook group who are just trying to do their best to help people because they have been through it and they know that it is a pain to do these applications. So there is lots of good information on there. Also, I've found that nowadays Twitter is a great resource for reaching out to students who are in MFA programs. Have you noticed that as well?
Yeah, that's really huge. And, professors in MFA programs are now constantly posting to Twitter about what they look for when they're reading applications too. Matt Bell did this recently. Elizabeth McCracken does this every year, which is great if you are applying to Michener. Yeah, she is amazing. I think there was 1 year when a how to write a statement of purpose guide that I had put out sort of peaked in popularity. And Elizabeth Kraken went on Twitter to complain that everyone was sending in statements of purpose with my particular format, and she found it very boring. And I felt famous. It was great. But, I think that Twitter is a wonderful resource. MFAers for a while, and hopefully again will be a wonderful resource.
Yeah.
Draft is huge. You can, even if they don't list themselves in the sort of official group document, you can find people in there from most schools and have a private conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. And once you are accepted somewhere too, you can often find other people who were accepted that program. So you can kind of get a sense of who potentially might be in the cohort with you, which is important to know, I think. Okay, so let's talk about the big one, funding. I know this is important to you. What should applicants consider about funding when they're choosing where to apply?
So, as evidenced by the fact that many of them support themselves as professors and not as novelists, we're pretty much out of the era of mega rich literary novelists. Like, that's done. Don't go into debt for an MFA because you think you're going to get $1 million book deal. That's probably not going to happen, even if you are very talented. I used to say, like, only go to places that pay you like $20,000 a year and up, because otherwise you need loans and you're taking out too much in loans. There are some people who have to take out loans no matter what. There was a woman in my she was in the year ahead of me at Ohio State. She was in my MFA, and she had kids who were, I think, a little bit older than mine. And actually, she needed to spend more money for them, so she just took out loans. I was in some ways really lucky to have a childcare scholarship as well. I'm not necessarily anti-loan. I'm anti, more loans than you will ever be able to pay off. I think that paying for a degree that is this unlikely to ever lead you to any sort of riches is a little silly. I think people should apply to fully funded programs. I think there are quite a few of them out there. You might as well maybe apply to partially funded programs and only go if they give you funding.
Right.
But I don't really, unless you are rich. And if you're rich, more power to you, ignore everything I'm saying. But unless you're rich, like, don't go pay a ton of money for an MFA. There's nothing that justifies that.
Yeah. And I think this comes back to that expectations thing that we were talking about earlier on, which is, yes, don't go into debt for this degree because it probably won't pay off, but temper your expectations when you're even considering going for an MFA at all, because beyond the money you're putting in years of your life, if you are convinced that all you have to do is get an MFA to become a famous writer, you're probably going to be disappointed. If you think all you have to do is to get a tenured track teaching job in a school teaching creative writing, all you have to do is get an MFA, you're probably going to be disappointed. Those jobs don't really exist anymore. So yeah, having some like tempering your expectations early on. But that being said, I mean, I know there are a lot of people that say like all of these programs should be funded, but I have found some people, non-traditional students who are at a point in their life where they can afford to pay for it, and they have other stipulations like there's only one city that they can study in, and they really want to work on their writing, and they can't leave that city, and there's one MFA program, and it's not fully funded, but they can afford to pay for it, then I guess having those programs is better than not having any program at all, right?
I would say so. I mean, I knew someone in undergrad who was actually an MFA student at Emerson because he wanted to stay in Boston. And he wanted to keep his job, and he could have gone to BU and been funded. But he would have had to quit his job because the pace of BU's coursework is just grueling. I mean, it's a year-long MFA program in which you take a ton of courses. So there are exceptions to all of these things. I think sometimes there are more full residency MFAs without sufficient funding than there are people who might need to take them for reasons of location. Far too many low-res MFAs. I'm not going to name which low-res MFAs. I'm just saying there are a lot of low-res MFAs, and there are a lot of people who would want MFAs and who I think would do really, really well with low-res MFAs. And that also gives you a way of not necessarily having to go to an MFA in X city. And It also helps you to work it around your job. There are people I've known who did very well for themselves at Warren Wilson and were able to keep their jobs as journalists and copywriters and stay in their cities. And I think that is an alternative people should also talk about too, as opposed to, only go to in-person MFAs, go to the closest in-person MFA regardless of funding. If time constraints are huge, maybe just go to a low-res MFA.
I mean, yeah, it just shows you how many things there are to consider and just how there is no recipe for like applying to the perfect program. It's so dependent on your own situation and where you are in your life and what you're looking for. So I guess maybe the first piece of advice would be make sure you're taking plenty of time to really think about why you want an MFA, what you think you're going to get out of it before you put the time and energy and money into applying.
Yeah, and also ignore people like me who say, don't pay for an MFA, that's silly, because in the next breath, we're going to be like, well, if you're a parent with a really sweet full-time job in DC, I guess you could go to George Mason and not be funded. If, maybe just go to Warren Wilson. I think that it certainly comes down to what's best for you. I think there are more unfunded opportunities than there are people who have any good reason to be taking them. That said, I also am a lot more flexible on all of these points than I would have been even in 2016, 2017.
When it comes to funding, there are various things to consider other than whether you're going to get tuition remission and a stipend, right? Just because a school is fully funded doesn't mean that it's funded well and funded fairly. So some things that you might want to consider are like fees, whether whether the school's going to waive fees, whether they're going to provide health insurance, and if not, how much of that is going to eat into your stipend. You want to think about teaching load, because some schools you don't teach at all, but you get funded. Some schools you're teaching 2 classes per semester. So what advice do you have when thinking about these factors?
Oh, I would go a step further. I mean, first of all, yes. I'm also trying to include fees on the fully funded list, because I've met people who were like, I turned down a $13,000 a year funded position for one that's $15,000 a year, but I pay $2,000 a year for insurance and another $1,000 for fees. So that is some math that is a little bit hard to figure out sometimes, but pretty important because it has a lot to do with your real income. The course load is huge. The course load is a big, big deal in terms of how much teaching you're doing. I think that, I'm coming at this as someone who had a kid throughout the entire process. If someone had expected me to teach 2 courses a semester, I couldn't have done it. That's just not happening. There's something that I think almost never gets talked about in draft or in other groups, which is that there are some schools that you take like your creative writing workshop and maybe one other course each semester, and then teaching on top of that isn't too big a deal. And there are some schools, like the one I attended, where the state legislature has decided that you have to take 12 graduate credits a semester and teach on top of it. And that can be a little bit of a rude awakening. Your course load as a student can influence this whole process every bit as much as your course load as a teacher.
So just in case there are listeners out there who didn't go to a school that had like credit hours like that, 12 hours per semester, you're talking about 4 courses per semester that you're taking and then teaching 1 or 2 on top of that.
So I think that, what was it? It was 12 credits in fellowship semesters. So I had to take 4 courses if I wasn't teaching, and then 9 during teaching semesters. So I was taking 4 courses, or I was taking 3 courses and teaching 1. And then I also had summer course requirements as well, actually. So that, that can be, it's no fault of the program or even the university. The Ohio State Legislature apparently forgot how grad school works. But that can be a huge deal. If you're at Michigan, you're, I think, supposed to take maybe, is it 9 credits per semester? But their workshops are counted as 6 credits, not 3.
Oh, interesting.
That makes a huge difference. Yeah. I just encourage people to find out how many classes you're taking, because that makes a huge difference to your experience too.
Absolutely. And how many classes you're teaching, of course, but what are you going to be teaching? Because it could be you're teaching composition studies and you have no background in composition studies. And so you're going to be doing a lot of reading and studying just to be able to teach that material to students. Whereas if you're doing maybe a fiction workshop, it's a little bit different. It's kind of in your wheelhouse.
Yes, composition studies can be incredibly hard. I taught at a school where it was very easy to place out of beginning English. So if you were teaching beginning English, your students, would often be people who, I think at least a couple of mine had undiagnosed learning disabilities. Many of mine were English language learners. So you also, what you're teaching can depend very much on the school, even if technically you're still teaching English 101 at every location. It can still make a huge difference whether or not you're teaching to every incoming freshman or just the incoming freshmen who weren't able to meet really easy placement requirements to get out of it.
Well, on top of considering what classes you're going to be teaching, another thing that I think people don't think about is the fact that the classes that you take in these programs can be quite different from program to program.
Yes, and that's huge too. I mean, I think that something Ohio State prides itself on and that I actually came to really enjoy is that it's rigorous. It's really academically rigorous. I mean, for whatever reason, I decided as long as I was there, I was going to learn Hebrew and Yiddish. And also, I was going to, like get into Jewish studies. And that was great. It's a lot of work. We had, in the English department, we had fairly typical workshops in creative writing. We had, I had my fiction workshop most semesters, and I took I took a poetry workshop and was horribly out of place, but the poets were very nice to me. And I took a nonfiction workshop. And different schools are going to have, these craft classes that are very intensive where you do a lot of reading and write your professor a short essay about what you've learned about novels this semester, in addition to just workshop. And so you really do want to see if you're going into an academic program or a more studio and workshop focused MFA.
Right. So the workshop obviously is a staple of all of these programs. So you will be taking workshops in your genre, but you want to look. Most programs require some literature courses, some don't. A lot of programs offer craft courses and or require craft courses. Some don't have them at all. Some programs require you to take a workshop in a genre outside of your primary genre. Some don't. So, there's a lot of factors to think about, and like what you're interested in and whether the program you're applying to is actually going to provide those. And I would say doing some digging and reaching out to people about what is actually offered and not just going by what's on the website. Because what I've found is that a lot of these programs will have course catalogs that are listed on their website, and 80% of the courses in the catalog haven't been offered in 10 years or something. So
yeah, if you can poke around the registrar and try to get a schedule of the most recent courses, like for last semester and the one before that, that's probably your best bet. Those are the ones they teach regularly. I came into Ohio State very interested in rhetoric and composition. I had done an undergraduate thesis on it, and I had, I had worked actually as a copy editor, and now I do again. And so there were a lot of things that I find really interesting about how we make decisions about writing things, what makes us decide, what is this bizarre process whereby English speakers decide that they're going to put a hyphen in something or not? That's so weird, but we do it and we make up rules about it. That's great. And so for me, that was all very exciting. And I quickly discovered that courses in that area were kind of struggling. And the ones I enrolled for kind of reliably got canceled. And then I went off and learned Hebrew instead. And that was great. It was fine. But I would have had a better idea if I had actually looked at these schedules and not the catalog. Yep.
I completely agree. That was definitely something that I did not consider at all when I was applying and when I was considering accepting a spot in an MFA program. But all listeners should definitely try to do that. The registrar, that's a good idea. Okay, so let's say you've considered all of these factors. You've decided with a clear head that, yes, this is what I want to do. So now you need to start considering each of the components to this application. So let's go through each of them. Obviously, we don't have all the answers, but we can talk a little bit about them, what we've learned. So let's start with letters of recommendation. Usually programs require around 3 of them. What do you think applicants should consider here?
So we did our panel on the 8th, and I got an interesting series of questions from applicants, really the same questions like a dozen times leading up to this panel that they wanted all of our panelists to address. And it was things like, I did creative writing in undergrad. None of my professors remember who I am. I haven't taken a single workshop since then. Can my boss at my marketing gig write me a letter of recommendation? And the answer is yes, sure. Your boss at your marketing gig, your boss at your dog daycare gig, wherever you work, your boss can write you one of your letters. But people who have not seen your creative writing cannot be writing you all 3 letters.
Right. But it can be hard for people. I mean, I had like almost 10 years between my undergraduate program and when I started applying for MFA programs. And so I was like reaching out to, well, and I should add that I was not very good as an undergrad of like really making connections with my professors. I went to a big, giant state school where, for a lot of them, I was just a number. So I was reaching out to, the 2 or 3 professors that I knew fairly well 10 years ago and saying, hey, remember me? Do you mind writing a recommendation letter for me?
And there's a real fear there, but did they say yes?
Of course they did, because they're lovely people.
That's their job.
Yeah.
They often remember you when you think they don't.
Yep.
And if you send them, like, hey, I did X and Y, here are my application materials, then it'll jog their memory. They'll remember you better. So there are a lot of people out there who I think do actually have writing professors who could write them letters of recommendation, and they just feel very intimidated to ask.
Yeah. But what do you do if you're, let's say, a student who didn't study English or writing, or like maybe you were in the STEM field, or maybe you didn't go to undergrad at all. Like, what do you do in these situations?
So if you didn't go to undergrad at all, I think there were for many years MFAs that would accept people without undergraduate degrees, but I'm not sure that's as much a thing anymore, which is unfortunate. I think that if you have an undergraduate degree in a STEM field, if you have not taken any workshops since then, you may actually have to wait a year. If you really have no one who has interacted with your writing as part of a workshop, preferably the instructor, you probably have to wait a year. And I don't like saying that in terms of, I don't like people thinking like, oh, I have to wait a year just to meet this stupid qualification where I can get, I can take a class, take an online class at Catapult for like $300. You'll do fine. Yeah, I don't like telling people like wait a year and spend $300. I think a better way to look at it is that there are people who have spent a lot of time in workshop honing their materials and getting used to other writers. And that if you really have no writing community at all and your creative sample has not been looked over by other people in a workshop, then you kind of needed to wait a year anyway.
It can be hard to hear, but yeah, I mean, I think there are so many factors that go into this, and it's such a big decision, and there's so much money involved that it's not a decision you should be making like a month before applications are due. Like, oh, I think I'm going to apply to an MFA program, right?
Yeah, and like and I'm not saying wait a year just because you need the letter of rec. I'm saying wait a year because this is really competitive.
Yeah.
And if you've never had any sort of workshop experience, then there are many ways in which, you're making it harder for yourself because you're disadvantaging yourself, in relation to other applicants.
Yeah. So if, in those situations, if there's any way you can get yourself into a workshop, whether it's virtually or in person, to really hone that writing sample, but also have people who can speak to your abilities for those letters of rec, I think is really important.
Yeah. Just someone to say, hey, I was in workshop with this person and they interacted nicely with the rest of the class. Nobody hates them. They write nice feedback. Because that is something that MFAs really want in their students, right? Is someone who can write nice feedback in a workshop, who can be helpful and generous with their regard for other people's work.
Yeah. I mean, let's not forget that the professors are looking for people that they want to work with for the next few years as well. They don't want a bunch of jerks in their workshop, right? So that's why something like a letter of rec is important, just for someone to vouch and say, hey, this person's nice, and they're thoughtful and they're considerate and they're hardworking. And I've been in a workshop environment with them and seen this. Yeah, I think it's important to have someone like that. Let's talk about another thing that's kind of starting to go away, which I'm really glad about, but some programs still require the GRE.
Dude, I love the GRE.
Oh, no.
So, okay, here's the thing. I grew up in Texas. They gave us multiple standardized tests a year, starting as soon as I could read. I am really good at standardized tests. It has zero relationship to any kind of intelligence, but I love it when grad schools are like, here you go. You know how to fill out these bubbles. We're going to give you a fancy fellowship. Like, it was the most completely unearned thing, but Ohio State actually gave me a very nice fellowship in part because of my high GRE scores. It very much like a pat on the back. You filled out the bubbles right. Have $25,000.
I'll take it.
Right? But no, I mean, it worked out for me. It's completely absurd. It has nothing to do with your ability to write. It doesn't measure any of the things they claim it measures. Like, I got twice the percentile ranking in math for the GREs of the person who taught me math. And this was my ex-husband. He was very, very discouraged by it. But it happens. It happens. Because it was just measuring, has someone sat you in a room and made you take one of these tests since you were old enough to read? And for me, the answer was yes.
I mean, I guess the idea behind it is like, it's partially testing whether you have the ability to really study something a lot for a long period of time and then perform, which I guess for some people, they think that's what grad school is, but the amount of money that I dropped on the GRE is insane. And the amount of hours I spent studying vocabulary for the GRE is insane. Also that, I could meet some minimum requirement and that I imagine the people looking at my application could go on to the next component and not really even think about my GRE scores.
Yeah, it's wildly unfair. I mean, it's completely absurd policy.
I did notice that a lot of programs this year especially are waiving the GRE requirement so that people don't have to go in person to take a test right now, and also don't have to spend that money when a lot of people are struggling financially. But just for anyone who knows, I mean, the general consensus is that the writing and the verbal part is the only thing that these programs are really looking at. They don't really care about your math score, but they might have a minimum requirement for the math score just as part of the college. So don't completely blow it off.
It's really frustrating too, because they can't change that minimum requirement. It's so often something the grad school is forcing them to do. I mean, if you brought any of my MFA professors on this show, they would say, yes, we loved that the grad school paid for Cady's fellowship. And we do not care about anybody's GRE scores when we decide to admit them because it has nothing to do with anything.
Well, let's talk about the statement of purpose, because I think a lot of people have questions about this. I know I had a listener from Nepal reach out to me recently named Mansi. Please forgive me, Mansi, if I'm mispronouncing your name. But she wanted to know what programs are looking for in a statement of purpose. Like, what are they looking for? How important are they?
They're so important in so many ways. And I actually think that departments should do away with them entirely. I think statements of purpose should not be required at any MFA. It's one of those things where, like, they matter enormously. And I can't defend it. I wish they didn't matter at all. I wish they were completely ignored.
Well, why do you think they should be ignored?
I think they don't measure the things that people think they measure. I think that when you look for someone's statement of purpose to signal that they're totally nice and they'll be fun to work with and they've read a lot and they're like ready to make interventions in today's literary scene, you might actually be selecting either for applicants who paid a person who already got an MFA to help them out, or for applicants who are really, really good at convincing people that they're great, super charismatic and magnetic because maybe they have a personality disorder. Like, I think that it just doesn't test what programs think it tests for, because it horribly disadvantages people on the basis of, they can't pay someone to help with this part, or they're shy, or they just don't really have a lot of career experience. I mean, it definitely, I think, discriminates on the basis of class, and on the basis of specifically mental health, as that relates to ability and disability.
So for listeners out there who are saying, I completely agree with that, but I still have to write one of these. So what should I be writing about?
Write something that proves that you read contemporary literature, that you're able to, that you're able to articulate what you do in your stories, what other people do in their stories, how your stories are like those other stories. That's a big one. You want to hit that. You don't actually have to prove that you've read the professor's reading. They're not as interested in that as they are in you proving that you read contemporary literary fiction, poetry, nonfiction, whatever you're writing.
So should we be looking at the professors and what they write and thinking, what would they want me to be reading? And I'm going to write my statement of purpose based on what I think they're going to want to hear. What should we do?
No. It turns out, as much as I wish you could just long distance mind read your potential professors like that, that's a good way to just devolve into neuroticism. Like you can't necessarily guess what the preferences of another human being who you don't know are going to be that accurately. You can prove that you read contemporary literature. You can prove that you know what people are doing in fiction, in nonfiction, and poetry. And you can prove that you can make craft evaluations. You can talk about someone's sentences. For me, that was huge. I like a big, complex clunker of a sentence. And I want to just sort of emulate the very circular, endless sentence that takes up a couple paragraphs, really. And so if you're able to talk about that, what craft elements interest you and how they've influenced you and which contemporary writers you feel a kinship with, that's way better than trying to guess what your professors will be into. Especially because sometimes it turns out the professors you thought were reading your application get jobs elsewhere and disappear before your application arrives at the school. Just don't bother with that. I think that another thing, aside from proving that you read, another thing you want to do is prove that you're pleasant to be around. That's huge in the letters of recommendation. And it's huge in the statements. You want to say, hey, I'm nice in workshop, and have it be convincing. Yeah, right? Like that's what they want to know is are you going to contribute to this community? You have to prove that you've heard about their school and you have reasons for applying there, because I totally just blanket applied to every place that I thought would give me enough money. I 100% confess to this, but they don't actually like that. Like when they admit you, they want there to be fairly good odds that you're going to show up at their school in fall. They don't want a letter that reads like you spammed it out to 30 programs. They want a letter that reads like you really thought about it and you want to go to their school because the duration of the program and the assistantship duties and, maybe the program literary magazine are all things that actually appeal to you.
Yeah, that makes total sense. I was going to say, try to show that you've actually looked into the program and done the research that we're talking about here, I think is really important because just like you want to feel special getting that note back saying, you're a genius, we want you to come to our program, they want to feel special too. Like, oh, you have looked into this program and you honestly think it's going to be a good fit for you and you want to study here and you're sincere about that. And you're not just, like you said, throwing your application out to everyone and hoping it lands somewhere.
And there's got to be more though. Oh yeah, why the MFA? Why do you want an MFA? Explain why you want an MFA. Give a realistic reason. Don't say, I want an MFA because I'm going to get a Booker Prize next year. I actually know someone who is, she was a Booker Prize finalist, and she hates MFAs and dropped out of 2 of them. So in case you were wondering, like, it doesn't, this isn't going to be the thing that makes you a famous author. Don't do that, but prove that you have realistic ideas. Say you love to teach. You love to teach, even if you know you're not going to get a tenure track job. Exactly. You just love to teach.
Right. Yeah, I was going to say, don't say, I want an MFA because I want to teach at a university, creative writing. I want a tenure track job. Because again, at this point, there's just not that many of those positions. Okay, but let's talk about teaching a little bit, because some of these programs, if you're going to be teaching, they want a teaching statement as well. Did you have to write one of these?
So I did write one of them. I also wrote a combined statement for Ohio State, because a lot of schools will also say, here's your statement of purpose, add a paragraph somewhere in there about teaching. And it's a very similar problem, is what do you say if you've never actually taught? Hopefully you've been in workshops and you've taken freshman English, so you have some idea of how the classes operate and how they should go. And it's completely okay to say stuff about how you would, in theory, teach and what you think the heart of teaching would be for you. I wouldn't take the opportunity to say, well, I'm super enthusiastic about it. Because, there's an assumption that you don't mind teaching if you're applying to a program where you know you will teach. And I think that in general, MFAs don't just give money to whoever says they're super enthused. You can't just tell them you want it bad enough and they'll say, wow, she wants it the most, giving it to her. But what you can do is have intelligent things to say about how your own classes have gone, even if you were the student, and what approaches to teaching you think work and how you would do it if you were the teacher.
And of course, if you have any teaching experience, that's going to be helpful. Or if you have any kind of experiences that you can lean on as a teaching experience of some kind, like if you've done any tutoring, if you've led some writing groups at the library, like anything like that you can lean on as teaching experience will be helpful in these statements, I think. Okay, we've talked a little bit about the writing sample. Is there anything we should add here? Because obviously everyone says it's the most important part of your application. What can we add here?
I know some people who are exceptions to this, right? Who just kind of like 15 poems on one page each sprang fully formed from their head, and then they got into Syracuse. But like, realistically, if you think that's going to be you, it's totally not. If no one has seen your writing sample, don't apply with it. Workshop it. There's actually Facebook groups attached to the draft workshop group or the draft Facebook group where people just workshop. There's a draft fiction workshop, which I know about because I started it. And you know what? You can get pretty decent free workshopping in there.
Yeah, so it goes back to just saying, like, if you realize that you don't have anyone who can write a letter of recommendation about your writing, you might need to wait a year. And don't wait to the last minute to decide, I'm going to apply to MFA program. It's going to be great. I'm going to get in. If you have a year to like think about these things and maybe get a little bit of tutoring experience, join a workshop, get some eyes on your writing sample, and really plan ahead of time for these, it's going to really help your chances getting, because it is so competitive.
Yeah, it is. It is competitive and it isn't. So you may have noticed that I liked contests for a while there when you were introducing me. And the way I think about those contests, and one of the reasons why I eventually had trouble with them, because it starts to make me feel maybe they're a little unethical. Something like 80% of the people applying just never had any chance. They're just not ready. That's very much true for these contests. I mean, I've read for contests at Ohio State, like you see the line of 200 and submittable, you read a page of each and you go nope to like 150 of them. So I think that people see the statistics and they see like a 1% admissions rate, and they go, oh my God, it's 100 other people and 99 other people, and every last one of them is just as ready as me. The problem is that every last one of those 99 other people aren't you. 70 of them they're just not ready, at least. But then there's that last 10 who have been thinking about nothing but this for like 5 years. And they're going to be really, really tough to beat. They're going to raise the bar and you need to rise to it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's great advice. At this point, listeners might be feeling a little overwhelmed. So let's talk about some resources that are out there. We've touched on a few of these. We talked about MFA Draft. I highly recommend going there for information. MFA App is one that I've heard of that's really great. Do you know about that?
MFA App Review. They're amazing. I paid someone money I did not have to look at my statement and writing. At which point he told me that because I'm a mom, I should definitely just go to a low-res MFA. And I said, that's not what I wanted. And also, like, you didn't do low-res and you have a kid too. Geez, I wonder what the difference is. If I had a woman in the house to care for my kid for me, would you tell me I was allowed to go to Ohio? Anyway, MFA App Review, hopefully, is going to be a little bit more sensitive than that. And they really exist to help share these resources. I mean, I believe wholeheartedly in their mission. They are looking for single parents. They are looking for people of color. They are looking for queer identifying writers. They want everyone who would be marginalized in an MFA environment, everyone who may have had trouble in undergrad because their teachers maybe liked some types of students better than others, to reach out to them, and they will pair you with a person who has gotten into a fully funded MFA, usually someone who's gotten into multiple fully funded MFAs and published some work, to look over your application and help you figure out what it's going to need to get it to the next level. And that includes like international students. If you are an international student, take advantage of this free service, because these are people who want to help you. Definitely single parents. If it had existed when I was applying, I should have done it. And like, it really, it's such a great service, and it's such a wonderful way of trying to sort of tilt what MFA environments are like.
Yeah. I mean, there's so much talk about the lack of diversity in these programs. And so when I first, I didn't know about MFA App Review, and one of my guests told me about it. I looked into it, and it just made me so happy. The fact that there are people out there who have gone through this experience, they've maybe, I don't want to generalize, but maybe didn't have the best experience, and now are saying like, okay, I'm going to do what I can to kind of, like you said, tilt the tables a little bit more towards equality in these programs, which I just think is wonderful. Before we talk about the workshop, are there any other resources out there that I'm forgetting?
There's things here and there. I think that it can be helpful to Google. There's a lot of literary magazines that will publish like 34 pieces of fiction and 2 one-off essays about the MFA that are really illuminating. And so I think that just keeping your eye on what writers are talking about on Twitter can actually lead you to a bunch of articles that maybe aren't published in like a space dedicated to MFA applications, but are actually super helpful.
Well, let's talk about the workshop. You are the editor-in-chief, and it is a wonderful resource. So can you tell the listeners about it in case they have never heard of it?
Yes. So the workshop started in 2014 as the MFA Years. Before that, there was a blog called the MFA Chronicles. I don't actually know when that started. I know that John Terry Gadsden at University of Virginia started the MFA Chronicles. And Caitlin Neely, also University of Virginia, started the MFA Years. In about 2018, for a variety of reasons, it kind of ran out of steam. But I was able to get in touch with Caitlin and talk about, we should really still do something with the site. I could just do stuff with the site. Would that be chill? And I was very happy to get a yes answer on that. I think that it would be fair to say that the MFA Chronicles and the MFA Years could be very much maybe more bloggy than I necessarily would want for the workshop. I found that as someone who was blogging for the MFA Years, people really expected a lot of personal content. How does the MFA make you feel? And I hate telling anyone how anything makes me feel. I mean, come on. I'm not an essayist, man. I'm writing fiction. I can only explain feelings when they are happening to other people. But at the same time, it did serve a really important purpose, which was, I think, showing people from all backgrounds that this is a real thing that happens for real people. Yes, another human being, a dude your age, is at Iowa, it's not this inaccessible world full of mysterious people who you can never be like. I mean, it's human beings who are going to a certain type of grad school. There were two things. Well, okay. There were blog entries that drove maybe the majority of the site's traffic sometimes, which were how the article I wrote about how to write a statement of purpose, the article I wrote about common misconceptions about submissions to literary magazines, very advice-centered, evergreen kind of, this is how you do X, is the sort of article that I love to write. I really want to help people, and feelings are hard. So we also had a fully funded MFA programs list, and we had a notifications board, which is going to go back up in January. So you heard it here first. And the fully funded MFA programs list is something that people really struggle to make accurate. As you can imagine, website information is not always 100% accurate. I know that Caitlin Neely had to remove a program from the list after, I think this was maybe 2017, they sent out like 24 unfunded offers. And she emailed them to say, hey, are you not fully funded? And they said, well, people who don't get funding usually don't show up. So everyone who's here right now is funded. So that counts, right? Stuff like that. And so there's a lot that goes into moderating lists like these. And right now I've been trying to build on the original things that I thought it could always use, like information like, will this place accept a 3-year Indian undergraduate degree? There are a ton of undergraduates or people applying from India who have undergraduate degrees that are just not acknowledged by American universities. And that's information that needs to exist somewhere and previously hasn't really existed anywhere. So every year you had people having to reinvent the wheel, call up all their schools from halfway across the world and say, hey, have you heard of a 3-year BCom in India, and do you accept it? And so that's something I wanted very much to centralize and add on. And what's another thing that I thought was really important to add? Oh, are GRE scores required? I've written yes for maybe like 2 schools this year, which is very gratifying. I like seeing that change. What are the language requirements? Obviously, you are an international student who's fine at English if you wrote fiction in English that got accepted, but there's procedural stuff that you should probably know about. And I've been trying to think, like, what is it like for student parents? None of this existed. And when I was applying, I had to do things. I called up George Mason when they let me in and was like, okay, so how does this work if I am a parent? And the woman who picked up on the other end said, oh, you've just gotten a job as a professor here and you're a parent. And I said, no, I'm a student who is a parent. And she said, oh, your daughter is a student here. And so one of the reasons that I ended up deciding to go to Ohio State is they had student parent housing.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, my daughter's best friend, who actually moved to Ann Arbor to start working at the University of Michigan at the same time that we moved to Ann Arbor so I could start attending the University of Michigan, lived like 50 feet from us in Ohio State student family housing. I mean, these are real intentional communities in some ways. And every year, student parents have to reinvent the wheel and do all this research over again. So for me, a lot of the list has now been about building on, here's the stipend, here's the surprise fees. The surprise fees are always fun. And here's how many courses you teach a semester, but also like, here's the university daycare, or whoops, this university has no daycare, and so on.
Yeah. Well, you recently, through the workshop, did an MFA admissions panel discussion. What were the main takeaways from that? How did it go?
I think it went really well. I wanted to, as much as possible, leave, questions for the panelists that were very clearly for the panelists. But if it was stuff like, should I apply to an MFA this year? It's December 1st and I haven't asked for any letters of rec. I felt pretty comfortable answering that one myself.
Yeah.
So I think I want to say we got a few dozen questions sent to us before the panel and 115 during the panel. And then some that came in through chat. I'd be comfortable saying we had about 175 questions. And I feel very comfortable that we answered all of them. It was interesting to see the questions that basically everybody shared, which were, what goes in my statement of purpose? I don't already work in publishing or have a novel out. And does that mean I won't be admitted? Stuff like that. There's definitely thematic recurring concerns that are really, really huge.
So for anyone who is considering applying but missed that discussion, is there somewhere where they can watch it back?
In fact, if you go to readtheworkshop.com/events, you can see the entire Facebook live stream, except for the parts at the beginning and end that I figured out how to clip out because they were just me going, why won't the camera work? But then we figured it out. And there is a document that has all of our questions that we didn't get to in the panel that were answered later. And then there's going to be a document with all of our questions and answers from the panel, because we had like writing, going on in the chat and in the Q&A window during the panel. And the chat transcripts are going to be up. And I'm going to work on they're not called subtitles, captions. I'm going to work on captions. So it's all going to be there eventually. I would say that right now, you can definitely get a lot out of the recording, and I think the additional sheet full of some extra questions is up.
That's great. Yeah, I did. I watched a bit of it, and it seems really helpful. So I definitely encourage all listeners to go to readtheworkshop.com.
Yeah. /events. Also, if you go to the mfayears.com, I think it still redirects to us, but you know.
Well, before we finish, I want to talk to you about life after the MFA. So, how many years has it been now since you graduated from Ohio State? And maybe you could just tell us like what you've been doing since, besides rebooting the workshop.
So I graduated in 2018, having taught myself Yiddish and Hebrew, and spent my final fellowship year actually at the University of Michigan taking Jewish studies courses. I entered a Jewish studies PhD. Around the same time, I got married. Then I got extremely sick repeatedly because it turns out that I have a genetic disease, and my daughter turned out to have relatively severe behavioral problems, ADHD, possible autism, sensory processing disorder, that were making school very hard for her. Then she got sick. Then I got hospitalized. Then I decided I really needed a divorce. And by the end of my first semester of the PhD, I was pretty sure that I was not going to be able to do the PhD. But I did fairly quickly find publishing work because I was in a university town. And that's something that is really worth discussing. My ex-husband actually was most of the way through his PhD when he became a little disillusioned with it, and also found publishing work. I think it can be really hard to hear this relentless drum of like, you're not going to be a tenure track professor. You will not win a MacArthur Genius Grant. Take a deep breath. You know, that sort of gets repeated back to applicants, I think for their own good. Because, you know, you don't want people to figure these things out by, not making it and then blame themselves. You sort of want them to have warning ahead of time that the economy of this is a little bit screwy right now.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of things the MFA does prepare you for. There are a lot of ways that you can have a satisfying work life and go right. And I think there's an attitude of do as little work as possible so you don't feel drained, and then you can go right. I've got to say, I'll work really hard so that I can have sushi delivered to my front door, because that really puts me in a mood to write. Like, I'm very happy at that point. So I think it depends on who you are. But there are jobs in copy editing. There are jobs in copywriting. There are jobs in publishing. There are universities looking for librarians and publishers that are not in New York City. And there are things that the MFA makes you better at and prepares you for. And I'm very lucky that I get to copy edit from the comfort of my home all day. And I really love what I do. You can also love what you do too. And you can earn more than people who are trying to become professors and work way less hard than them, which I highly recommend. So I want to plug that. We're actually starting a column in January with MFA graduates, just explaining how they got their jobs. Grant writers, people who help administer university tutoring centers. There are things that you can do out there in the world so that you don't have to feel too upset by the fact that we don't really live in the era of the self-supporting novelist anymore.
And what's the name of that column going to be?
The Grind, which also works because, man, I need a lot of coffee some mornings in order to figure out where the commas go. Like, I know intellectually where they go, but the Microsoft Word window just swims in front of my face. This might be more of a mom thing. But I will say that if you learn to pay really close attention to every single word in the way that an MFA should teach you, then you are already practicing to be a copy editor. And you might need some training about knowing what things you're supposed to be looking out for and what rules you're supposed to be enforcing. But you've definitely got the paying close attention to written content down. I think that people should not feel too helpless, even though there are no tenure track jobs and universities are dying.
Yeah. I mean, we've talked about expectations a few times now. The flip side of that is that there are other things out there that you can be doing other than being the prize novelist or being a tenured track professor. So, last word, what have I missed? Is there anything we haven't discussed yet that you think applicants should consider, or just any advice you have beyond what we've already said for people who are just starting their MFA journey?
Yeah, you should, everyone, and I always say this, should learn to just get real comfortable with failure. Maybe that's a depressing thing to say, but I think that if you can separate your writing from your humanity, if you can say, wow, this story I wrote just kind of sucked. I don't know what's up with me this month. I'll write a better one. I'm still a valid person, and saying this story sucked is not an admission that I suck. That's a really good place to be in. I think saying I'm not a professor, but people who aren't professors are still people and they get to go outside more. That's a really good place to be in. So I think that if I were leaving everyone with a final word, that word would be, just learn to be flexible, learn to fail at things, develop a sense of self apart from your writing, and know how to feel good about yourself, even if 5 lit mags send you rejection letters in one morning and that morning is Valentine's Day, because it's happened.
Cady, thank you so much for being here. This was fantastic.
Well, thank you so much for having me.